So today we're going to delve a bit deeper into Nero's Philhellenism, his love of Greek culture, and think about two things in particular. Firstly, why the stories of Nero's love of Greek music and theatre are so bound up with tales of his sexual depravity, and secondly, why the sources are so appalled by this Philhellenism, especially as Hadrian, one of the good, in inverted commas, emperors, was also a Philhellene, but wasn't nearly so criticised by the sources as Nero was. So various sources tell us that Nero's interest in performance, which had been clear from childhood, became stronger and more publicly expressed, ultimately a key part of his public persona, as his reign progressed. And Tacitus especially uses this to symbolise Nero's growing tyranny alongside the waning influence of his advisors. You can see here from Bradley's overview of how his performances became kind of more public, and also how they shifted both in their emphasis and their geography towards Greece, culminating in Nero's tour and liberation of the province in AD 66. So what was he hoping to achieve by this? Well, by appearing before the people, he was establishing their perception of him as emperor. It's clear that he wasn't on stage in disguise, that he didn't expect his costumed appearances to deceive anyone, as this story from Suetonius, which is also echoed in Dio, shows. When he appeared very much as the Emperor Nero. He also forced aristocrats to appear in his shows. Gaius, you might remember, had done similar things. This was obviously not befitting their dignity, but as Alston's comment here makes clear, it was a really great way of Nero asserting his authority, and you can see why our largely senatorial sources take such issue with this behaviour. It wasn't just an interest in theatre and music, though. Nero was also a patron of the arts. Rather as Augustus had extended patronage to Maecenas, for example, Nero surrounded himself with authors such as Seneca, Petronius and Lucan, and he allowed them quite a lot of freedom of expression. Look into Lucan's Pharsalia or Civil War if you're interested in seeing how that came across. So these wide-ranging cultural interests, theatre, architecture, and we'll talk about the Golden House of Nero when we cover the Great Fire, and literature, established Nero as emperor in his own right, and perhaps his desire to establish himself in this way is understandable, given the way that his early reign was dominated by the influence of others. As Alston says, Nero wasn't an army commander or a member of the Senate like Augustus or Tiberius. He wasn't a god like Gaius. Rather, he was something different, something distinct. This message was lost, deliberately or not, on the Senate, and therefore on our sources. They combine accounts of Nero's Philhellenism, his cultural pursuits, with tales of sexual depravity like this one from Dio. Feel free to pause the video if you want to read through that. And this combination of Philhellenism, of cultural interests and, sexual depravity, corruption, is partly because both sorts of behaviour are viewed by our sources through the same lens. But I think there's a deeper meaning to Nero's sexual misbehaviour than simple scandal. So his actions, such as castrating and marrying Sporus, paint him in the sources as a tyrant enslaved by his passions and thus incapable of ruling. And if you want to see how common this equation of sexual and political incompetence was in Roman thought, then check out, for example, Cicero's attack on Mark Antony in Philippic 2. Now, Alston calls Nero's behaviour unconventional, but it's obviously a lot more than that. Nero wasn't just defying an old convention, but establishing a new one. And as Alston puts it, if to be Roman was to abide by the traditional morals of Rome, then Nero's rejection of those moral values creates a fundamental problem in Roman identity politics. This problem is one of cultural memory. These film posters, I think, show pretty well what our cultural memory of Nero is. The Romans of Nero's time had their own cultural memory of what it meant to be Roman, and Nero was totally incompatible with it. Augustus, Tiberius, even Claudius had attempted to pay lip service to the old traditions of senatorial governance, But Nero undermined those completely. And actually, we should give him some credit for recognising the hypocrisy in the system, and rather than trying and failing to play along with the system, trying to reinvent it. So his orgies, just like his engagement with Greece, were actually a political statement of his refusal to be bound by the old and the conventional. Rather than an empire based solely on Italian and old-fashioned republican values, Nero was offering a new Hellenized identity. As Alston says, the whole point of Nero's reign was to remake the culture of power, to break with the political culture of the past, and to invent a new cultural politics. And it was this that ultimately brought him into conflict with the senators, who clung to the old culture even as Nero was trying to impose a new one. So during this period, we see the development of an intellectual opposition, it's often termed the Stoic opposition, to the Principate as an institution, which drew on Republican traditions. And this intellectual opposition reached its peak in the writings of Tacitus. Tacitus particularly seems to have felt some sort of guilt at the fact that he hadn't really formed a very effective intellectual opposition to Domitian, but had instead kind of kept his head down. And given that Tacitus is one of our key sources, it's perhaps not difficult to see why Nero's legacy is what it is.